But it was an interesting time to be in Memphis. I was there in 67, 68, 69, and the Memphis sound was really happening then. The soul music, as they called it, was really hot around the country. Artists would come into Memphis a lot, Memphis and Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to kind of capture the sound of the studio musicians in Memphis and Muscle Shoals. So there was a lot of music activity there.
This is the Talking Archive. You're hearing the voice of Mike Hambrick. He's a radio and television broadcaster, newscaster for many years, and he's also the author of 2 books. And Mike, thanks for being with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Josh. It's good to be here.
Thank you. And tell us about your background and how you got into broadcasting.
Well, it's a familiar story I'm sure you've heard many times over. I started as a teenager in high school working for a small 1,000-watt radio station in Greenville, Texas, and was fortunate enough after about a year and a half of doing that, my last year in high school and the first semester into college, I got a job off to go to Memphis, Tennessee, which was a huge, major jump for a little kid in Northeast Texas. And so I made that move when I was 18 and a half, I guess, close to 19. And it was to FM 100, which was one of the first FM stations in the country to go album rock is what they would call it. We called it hard rock then. It had many names, but it was album cuts and things of that nature. It was the opposite of top 40 radio, and it became a very successful station through the years, thanks in large part to the program director, who was Mike Powell, who came out of top 40 radio, worked for the McClendon stations in Texas. I had a DJ, John Scott, and another one, Greg Hamilton. They kind of made the real core of the station, and very talented guys at the time, and committed to the music. The music was the main thing going on at that point. And people listening today that are not baby boomers would have to kind of rewind the tape and explain to them what real radio was. We don't really have real radio much anymore, especially when it comes to contemporary music. You have the satellite stations, but and those are great. Eventually, for a while, I worked with Howard Stern at Sirius XM.
Wow.
Yeah, that was kind of it was a fun thing to do, but that was within recent. I think it was there from 2014 to 2016. But there were a lot of bridges crossed and water under the bridge through the years. I eventually got out of rock and roll radio. I guess it was in 1972.
Now, with rock and roll radio, just out of curiosity, how much freedom did you have? Because I know that rock back then, the disc jockeys pretty much selected their playlist. Was that the format of your radio station? Was it more kind of even Steven? Some was selected for you, others was kind of, you got to choose.
Well, it was a combination of both. I always worked the 7 to midnight, 6 to 9 evening shifts when I was working on FM 100. And at the time, the top 40 had not, AM top 40 music had not gone away by any means, and the major national program director was the Bill Drake format that was, in the major markets. KHJ there in Los Angeles was a Drake station. There was one in Memphis, WHBQ, and it's hard to imagine, Josh, but back during those years, people owning FM radio was not ubiquitous. I mean, that was part of our problem as far as the ratings went, is that most of the stations did not have, most of the listeners did not have FM radio. So it was a real challenge, and we had contests of giving away FM radios and, trying to increase the market for FM radio. The station was it was a Scripps Howard station. It was grandfathered in with a large antenna and power. It was like 300,000 watts, which carried a long way in the Mississippi Delta, Memphis south into the Delta. Mm-hmm. But most FM stations are limited to 100,000 watts. But that was somehow grandfathered in. Scripps Howard at the time owned in Memphis both morning and evening newspapers, a TV station, the AM radio station, and an FM radio station. So Scripps kind of had the monopoly in the market.
Wow.
As far as ownership of media outlets are concerned. But it was an interesting time to be in Memphis. I was there in 68, 69, 67, 68, 69. And the Memphis sound was really happening then. The soul music, as they called it, was really hot around the country. And artists would come into Memphis a lot, Memphis and Muscle Shoals, Alabama, to kind of capture the sound of the indigenous musicians that were, the studio musicians in Memphis and Muscle Shoals. And so there was a lot of music activity there. And it was really kind of wide open. It was eventually it became very corporate, so to speak. The music industry did in Memphis, but at that time it was still pretty wide open. And we would hang out at studios during sessions with Booker T and the MGs or Otis Redding or Sam and Dave, those kind of places. It was an interesting time. And I was there when Martin Luther King was assassinated as well in April 4th, 1968. And that is to a large degree the conspiracy that I did a tremendous amount of research on, and came to the conclusion that, of course, James Earl Ray was not the shooter. It was a government conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. As was there were 4 assassinations, major assassinations in the 60s. John F. Kennedy, president, of course, in 63. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, and Malcolm X were all assassinated in the decade of the 60s. So it was a turbulent time. The Civil Rights Movement and the Civil War, the Vietnam War, were causing a great deal of civil unrest in cities across the country, including Memphis. So it was an interesting time to be in the media. But I went on to, I worked in stations in Mobile and actually went into country music for a while. I was music director for a very large 50,000-watt clear channel station in Cleveland, Akron, WSLR. And then the last job I had in rock and roll radio was at an AM station. And I answered an ad at broadcasting for, they wanted a program director in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So it was kind of a lark. I didn't have, I was just still a young kid basically and didn't have much to do. So I said, okay, why not? So I sent him a tape and all of that stuff that that people used to go through. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, they hired me. So I went to work for the only English-speaking radio station on the island that was owned by Bob Hope at the time.
Wow.
And that was pretty much the end of my rock music part of my broadcast career. I stayed there for a couple of years, and I got what they referred to as island fever. after about 2 years, and they predict this, that you either get freaked out and say, wait a minute, my life is, I got to do something with my life, otherwise I'm just going to end up being an island bum, or I got to go respond to the Judeo-Christian work ethic and do something. So I opted to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of strange. There were 3 Hambrick brothers. My 2 older brothers and myself eventually became TV news anchors. And we worked in major markets all around the country as newscasters. And my 2 older brothers, John and Judd, actually worked at KBC in Los Angeles at the same time. They were newscasters. So we were news directors kind of referred to us as, well, I won't use the word, I guess, but you can cut it out if you want to. They would say, Hambricks are like assholes. Everyone's got one, you know. So that was right. So I did that, and then I ended up working the last 20 years of my broadcast career in Washington, D.C. So you don't spend a lot of time in Washington in the media where politics is king. It's like politics is to Washington like the movie industry is to Hollywood. That's what everybody seems to, it's lawyers, lobbyists, and government workers. So I when I got out of anchoring television news, I became a communications consultant for members of Congress and Fortune 500 CEOs. But I did keep my one foot in broadcasting. I did a couple of syndicated radio programs, issue-oriented political programs, and I did some talk radio at KLIF in Dallas. I worked 9 to midnight there. I actually was anchoring the news for a while in Dallas at CBS Texas, and this was during the first Gulf War, so they asked me if they knew that I actually worked in Washington twice. They knew I had Washington experience, and so when the war, leading up to the war and afterwards, they wanted to utilize my contacts and connections in Washington and have that presence. So I did that for a while. And then, and as I say, I worked for two stations as a newscaster in Washington, NBC, Channel 4, and ABC 7. And so then I just really did kind of reinvented myself multiple times, started a couple of entrepreneurial efforts, pretty much all related to the media industry. And I worked I was senior VP of communications for the National Association of Manufacturers, which is the largest trade association and policy shop for manufacturing in Washington. So that was kind of interesting, and that kept me in politics. And I even ended up running, I was campaign manager for statewide gubernatorial campaigns. So I really did get into politics a lot.
Wow.
But then I decided I would retire for a while, and that didn't take too well. I don't think baby boomers ever really stop working. So I formed a couple of other, media consulting companies, and in fact, as I mentioned, I'm starting a new one now called Circle Media, which we have 2 podcasts in production, and I'm also writing the second novel, which is a sequel to Memphis, the conspiracy to assassinate Martin Luther King. That novel is called Dance with the Devil, and I'm simultaneously writing screenplays for actually not full feature movies, but episodic series, streaming series, like you would see on Netflix or Amazon or wherever you might pick it up, Paramount.
Wow.
So we're doing that, and looking at probably doing music videos and producing that as well. So I'm trying to stay busy, you know.
Oh, yeah.
My media is always, well, since I was 17 years old, that's all I've done. You know, I was quite fortunate in that regard, I guess. I actually knew what I wanted to do with my career in life at 17, and I pretty much did it, you know. Had a good time doing it, traveled the world, covered assassinations and presidents and wars and all kinds of stuff that I wouldn't have thought as a ragtail kid in Northeast Texas I'd ever have the opportunity to do. So I feel real fortunate about that as I look back on it.
We're talking with newscaster, radio host, and author Mike Hambrick. And next time, Mike talks more about his radio days and some of the people he got to work with.